I'm delighted to join you this morning on these deliberations for the current conference, and I was specifically asked to come and talk about the role of HR in economic development. Let me start by trying to draw a distinction between two words which more often than not are used interchangeably, yet they are different. We have economic growth on one hand, and we have economic development on the other. When you talk about economic growth, we are basically referring to a rise in the volume of goods and services, or the value of goods and services which have been produced within a given country, Kenya inclusive, of course. But on the flip side of it, when you refer to economic development, you are basically referring to net economic welfare, with the implication that there should be a rise in the standards of living of the people. So those two phrases are different. For economic growth to be realized, it means that we must witness a rise in the value of goods and services which are produced within a given country. And that means we have to work with some baseline, and then there has to be a rise from that baseline. Economic development is net economic welfare, and this can only be manifested through a rise in the standards of living of the people. If you talk about economic development, there must be a rise in the standards of living of the people. The inference of this, ladies and gentlemen, is that economic growth leads to economic development. Against that background, to put us on the correct anchorage, I want then to advance a correlation between HR and economic development. We need to understand that, first of all, labor is a factor of production. That's where we start from. Labor is a factor of production. And for us to realize economic development, we must witness a rise in the productivity levels. That is the correlation. The implication is that economic development, therefore, becomes a function of the level of productivity. And you cannot have productivity unless you have labor as a factor of what? As a factor of production. I thought it is important to give that background so that when I advance my propositions and arguments, then we will be on the correct premise. How then does HR contribute to economic development as a factor of production, or the HR function? How does the HR function contribute towards economic development? One, in any given economy, development is not undertaken in a vacuum, but is guided by certain policy propositions or policy documents. I would use the Kenyan context to advance my arguments. Today, we are aware that our development agenda is pegged on the Kenya Vision 2030. And right now we are in the last phase of that, the fourth medium-term plan of the Kenya Vision 2030. Equally, the development agenda of the current administration, the fifth administration, is anchored on the bottom-up economic transformation agenda, where we have agriculture, universal health coverage, affordable housing, small and medium enterprises, and then the digital ICT and the digital economy and the national superhighway as thematic areas. We also need to understand that as we think of our HR practices, our HR plans, we must then align to the overall development agenda. not just within the Kenyan context, but even regionally. We have to think of alignment to the EAC Vision 2050, continentally to the AU's Agenda 2063, and globally to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, because development does not take place in a vacuum, but within a wider context of national, regional, continental, and global policy frameworks. So everything that we do must be aligned to all those policy documents. The first role, therefore, of HR in the development context is planning. We must have prudent HR planning if we are to realize economic development. So we must determine the human resource capacity needs, both quantitatively and qualitatively, to realize economic growth on one hand and economic development on the other. Planning is imperative, and that is why at global level, continental level, regional, and even national level, we must have HR plans if we are to realize our goals and objectives, so that we have got the right human resource capacity within the economy. Right human resource capacity within the economy. That is a fundamental role of HR. Manpower planning, human resource planning, which is aligned to the overall development framework. Again, within that planning space, as an HR function, you cannot draw an HR plan in a vacuum. You must start by looking back in retrospect to realize the milestones that you have gained in the HR space, the challenges you have faced within the HR function, and what you need to do moving forward to overcome those challenges, the lessons which you have learned, the gaps in HR. You must align HR to what is happening in the operational environment through a PESTEL, policy, legal, environmental, social, technological factors. You then determine the critical success factors for HR aligned to the overall development agenda, and so on and so forth. Just the same way you do strategic plans, you must also have HR plans which are aligned to the overall development plans within a given economy. And if you have got a plan in place, then the next integral role of HR in economic development is ensuring that we have the right structures to enable us deliver on the plans that we have. That's an integral role of HR. And this is ordinarily the staffing function of HR. And as you do this, those structures must be informed by the functions that we need to undertake to realize our development goals and objectives. The biggest challenge we face in organizations, ladies and gentlemen, more so with respect to organization structures, is that we start by looking at people whom we have in the organization and how we can accommodate them within the organization structure. That is a lopsided, if not retrogressive, thinking from an HR practice. Structures are aligned to strategy. You cannot align strategy to structure. So it is the role of HR function to ensure that we have the right organization structures within the economy to enable us realize our overall goals, development goals and objectives as spelled out on the national development policy documents and plans. With that in place, it is again the fundamental role of HR to ensure that we have got the right people possessing the right skills and competencies to deliver on our development agenda. And this ordinarily is the staffing function of the human resource. You start all the way by doing a functional analysis. Once you have undertaken the functional analysis, you develop the job descriptions and person specifications. You bring staff on board based on their skills, competencies, and capabilities by way of staffing. Once you have brought them on board, you ensure that they are well placed, the placing function. Within that staffing function, we have got training and development so that people have got skills, the right skills and competencies in line with the development agenda in the country. You ensure that you train them and develop them in line with what is happening in the market. And then you also retain them. You can be recruiting, attending staff, but not retaining staff. So that's the next integral function of HR in line with economic development. Then we move to leadership. You must offer leadership to the human resource within the economy as HR functions, so that people move to the desired direction with a view to realizing the overall goals and objectives as spelled out in the plans. This is a function that predominantly is undertaken by HR. Leadership. You may have people in the organization, but unless there is facilitation through transformational leadership aligned to the overall policy agenda, development policy agenda, then you may not be able to realize your goals, economic goals and objectives. So leadership as an integral function of HR in economic development. And once you lead the people, to enable you lead the people effectively, you must have a control function. And this ordinarily is what you execute all the time by way of performance management. You cannot manage performance in the economy unless performance management is aligned to the overall planning framework within the economy. So those two are interrelated, if not Siamese twins. The planning function of HR and the performance management function of HR. Again, we have got phrases, terms people use interchangeably as if they mean the same thing, yet they are different. When you talk of performance contracting, people confuse it with performance management. Performance management is an umbrella term that refers to all the control functions that the HR function undertakes with a view to realizing the goals and objectives that we want to attain within the economy. But within that performance management framework, you undertake performance contracting, where you commit people beforehand to attaining certain performance levels, both quantitatively and qualitatively, so that we meet our performance targets within the economy. That is performance contracting. But based on the performance contract that people sign, at some point in time, more often than not every year, you hold people to account by way of performance appraisal or performance evaluation. And in modern management, the purpose of performance evaluation is to not to punish those who are underperforming, but to correct performance deficiencies so that we are able to meet our national economic goals and development goals by way of productivity levels. So in this context, performance management and productivity improvement are interlinked. And by extension, there is a correlation, again, a positive correlation between productivity improvement and the level of economic development. And this, again, is facilitated by HR. So the purpose of performance management is to improve productivity, not to punish those who are underperforming. Over and above that, there are certain other integral functions of HR which are linked to economic development, ladies and gentlemen. The other one is reward management. Based on performance contracting results, there is need to tie the same to a reward management framework that will give people the impetus to work hard and meet the goals and objectives or the performance parameters that they have been assigned at the beginning of the contracting period with very, very clear performance indicators and time-bound targets. We need to tie reward to performance. This is the work of HR. To increase productivity, to give people the impetus of working hard, there must be some reward tied to exemplary performance on one hand, and also sanctions. This is what we are trying to do in government. When I moved to this space of performance management and delivery, I realized that we were doing routine performance contracting and appraisal, an annual event, more or less a ritual because it has to be done. We are moving away from that. We want to institutionalize performance management in the public service to the extent that we are going to anchor performance management onto law. I've already come up with a draft performance management bill which I want to progress so that we have an act to have a strong legal foundation so that the results of performance appraisal can be legally enforceable and then operationalized based on attendant regulations. Then we also have change management in the economy. We have got fundamental changes. To begin with, every other time when there's change in government within the economy, each and every government comes with its own policies. If change is not well managed, it can cause disequilibrium. If there is too much change, again, on the other hand, people may get immobilized or destabilized. It's again the role of HR in an economy to ensure that we have effective change management with a view to realizing the goals and objectives and the economic targets that we have. You need to carry people along anytime change is being introduced. They need to understand why that change is imperative, what their role will be in the change process, what will be the likely output or impact, the end result of change. If people don't see a linkage between the benefits of change and the change program, you will lose the people, and you will not be able to meet your goals and objectives. And this is a fundamental role of HR within the economy. Effective management of change. And also ensuring that we introduce change in doses. Too much change can also be counterproductive. We must have an optimal level of change within the economy. Then there are standard other practices you do every day with a view to creating an enabling environment for human resource. Issues to do with employee relations, industrial relations, good relationship within the working environment, laws, regulations, labor laws and regulations. That again is another fundamental role of HR, and ensuring conformity to the same so that we don't have disturbances within the labor environment that can cause economic instability. The other fundamental role is health and safety, tied to the environment again. So I can go on, ladies and gentlemen, but the long and short of it is that for us to realize both economic growth on one hand and economic development on the other, HR has got an integral role to play based on the functional mandate of the HR function within an organization or within the economy. So my conclusion by inference is that there is a direct correlation between the HR function based on its mandate and the level of economic growth on one hand, and by extension, economic development on the other. Thank you very much.